Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. Thank you very much for tuning in today. 770-5790, 1-800-687-0790. You can send in your thoughts on the KFYO text line at any time, 806-680-2790. It's live radio, folks. That's exactly right. Congressman Jodey Arrington walking into the studio as we speak. He's trying to figure out which chair to go to.
I'm not sure how to take your motioning me to go to the seat furthest from you. I plopped down right next to Chad, folks, and he kind of gave me the kind of shoo away deal,
right.
Which, by the way, I'm so immune to. Like, if that's all I get when I come home, I mean, that beats rocks and tomatoes.
Well, that's
being
good.
Thrown
Yeah.
at you but it's great to be here. God bless West Texas.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Glad to have you back here in studio. Appreciate you swinging by. You've been busy. You've been holding some town halls and talking to folks across the district.
I have. We've had several. I think the last one I did was Big Spring. It was packed. And, you know, half of the Democratic Party showed up. They had their shirts
nice.
on. And
That's good.
I will say this. I said, let's do a town hall the way it's supposed to be done, where you have impassioned debate, dialogue, and but you don't let it spiral down to being disrespectful and rude to anyone. And you know what? It was great. And we had a very open and candid dialogue about all the issues you can imagine, from the recent shootings and to border security, which are really the top two issues that come up everywhere I go, whether it was Friona Muleshoe or Big Spring or Morton today. I expect that those two will be at the top of the list. Of course, trade with China. All the farmers and ranchers, the ag producers are concerned, but I think the short answer to that one is they know it's going to be painful. They stand behind the president. They know he's doing the right thing. There's never a good time to hit reset with China because it's like being in the debt hole by $22 trillion.
Yeah.
You're not getting out of it without pain. Nobody wants to do it. No politician wants to take on that very unpopular exercise except Donald J. Trump.
Yeah.
So I think that may be the best contribution, other than the judicial appointments, is how he's taking on China. And he's given a lot of support to the farmers in the way of trade aid to kind of smooth this rough patch till we get to the other side and to the greener pastures. But, you know, it has to be done. And I can tell you, the ag producers stand behind him. It may be painful, but they're standing with him.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about gun control. And
I'm against it.
And I know you are. There's a lot that is obviously that's been said, that's been going on. If he wants to come in here, we got extra chairs. That's all right. There's a lot that's been said, a lot that's been brought up by the press and by the administration, possibly as things that could come up. Red flag laws have been talked about by the administration. Expanded background checks have been brought up by the administration. Just last week, I had Kayleigh McEnany on the show. She's press secretary for the Trump re-elect campaign, and she said she was laying the groundwork pretty thick for both red flag laws and for expanded background checks. Congressman, where do you come in on those two issues?
Well, let me say that nobody, Republican or Democrat, condones what happened. It's heinous. It's evil. And if we could stop it with the wave of a magic wand from Washington, we all would. Okay. But it is obviously more complicated than people make it out to be. And there's always this knee-jerk reaction because people want Washington to solve all of our problems. And I think to the extent that we can do something in Washington, don't get me wrong, we should. But we can't do anything that's going to make it harder for law-abiding citizens to exercise their Second Amendment right, period. And we as Republicans in the 115th Congress, when we had total control, right, the Senate, the House, White House, we passed a fixed nix, which was to make the instant criminal background check system work better because It failed, for example, in the Sutherland Springs shooting.
Yeah.
That guy shouldn't have been able to purchase a gun. Now, 80% of the time that crimes are committed with guns, those guns are stolen or bought on the black market. So 80% of the time, it doesn't matter whether you fix NICS or what you do on the background check system, it won't help. And then in this most recent shooting or shootings, El Paso and Dayton, H.R. 8, for example, the Democrats' version of a background check, which is flawed in so many ways. It's bureaucratic. It's overreaching. I mean, if I give my nephew a gun, I could go to jail for a year and be fined $100,000. If I know a woman who is who is involved in domestic violence or being stalked, if I let her borrow my gun, I could go to jail or be fined $100,000. That one is a non-starter for me. But H.R. 8 and any background check law or reform legislation proposal would not have stopped El Paso and Dayton.
Right.
So we've got to do things that will actually go to changing the outcome in a way that we all want, which is to prevent this to the extent we can. We put more money on mental health. We gave tools to law enforcement to better coordinate. We gave money in partnership with states to harden schools. I mean, those things are real, but pretending like a background check system is going to stop these guys is just another Washington sleight of hand. And maybe it makes somebody feel good, but it's not going to do the trick. And the red flag laws, I'm concerned with due process. I mean, the presumption of innocence is the bedrock foundation of our judicial system and due process.
Right.
So the burden's on the state to prove. And if my neighbor or your friend or maybe a co-host of another show that doesn't like you says, you know what, Chad's been talking awfully crazy on the radio, and then somebody comes and confiscates your guns, and then you have the burden of proof to go through the court system to get them back. Look, there's probably a way you can expedite a true process that by which a judge or a jury of your peers can render somebody mentally unstable. If we can find an expeditious way to do that in the case of imminent threat, I'm open to that. But the red flag laws that I've seen just compromise due process in a way that I think is dangerous.
Well, and again, I don't see, especially in the case of the El Paso shooter, there were no red flags. It doesn't appear. You know, there were red flags maybe in Dayton, but it only goes so far if people speak up. It goes back to, you know, what we were talking about after the terrorist attacks of 2001. If you see something, say something. There are a lot of people out there, Congressman, who they may know somebody who, you know, they're going to school with that, oh, man, they're just not right. That person seems like they might be a mass shooter. But they're not going to tell anybody that because they're like, well, that person's just kind of weird. There's just something off about that person, but they're not going to report them to law enforcement. We need to maybe change that type of mindset, right?
There's no question. It's just like with terrorism, the radical Islamic terrorism. And certainly we've got better at intervening and thwarting attacks from the sort of intelligence agency, Homeland Security, and then just the overall awareness of the public. So, yes, most of these folks who go on these murderous shooting sprees tip their hands at some point to somebody, and maybe they're just not taken seriously. Yeah. I mean, there was a case in Lubbock, Texas. I know you read the newspaper, and if it weren't for this young man's grandmother, we might have had one of these here in Lubbock, but it was in the local law enforcement prevailed on this young man because of the tip of a family member. So, yeah, those things have to be taken seriously. But again, nobody wants to talk about the degradation of the societal, traditional institutions of church and family. Yeah. Nobody wants to talk about the context now of violence in music and video games and movies, although I don't think video games is the reason people kill people. I really don't. I think that we've always had folks, and if you read the LA Times story, it's really good. I think it's pretty unbiased in terms of politics. The number one thing that these folks cite, and they've studied it since the 1960s and the first mass shootings, they say these folks often were exposed to violence at a young age, and they had early childhood trauma, whether it was physical abuse or sexual abuse. So we've always had these folks, and it's sad. It is so sad. And they'll withdraw and become antisocial, and they'll be dealing with these really sick, perverse, depraved thoughts. And now the only difference is they can go on the dark digital underworld of the internet and get on these Chan 8s and these open forums, and I'm using Chan 8 because that's the one that I think the El Paso shooter was on, and they can start to validate each other. And then all of a sudden you have accelerated, and you have made it now, you've enhanced the world of folks with these that warped, crazy, hate-filled thoughts and pure evil in their hearts. And I think that's why you're seeing this. I think that's a big problem. And again, I don't think there's a law in Washington per se, and it's certainly not an issue of guns, because we know that people, more hammers, more hands, more knives, cars, bombs. You can just go through the litany of ways that one who has this mindset will be hell-bent to do destruction. They'll find those means to do so.
We'll take our next break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Congressman Jodey Arrington, hanging out in the district. I'm sure he's glad to be here and not in Washington, D.C. right now, and we're glad to have him in studio. We'll be right back. Chad Hasty Show, KFYO. Chad Hasty Show, News Talk, KFYO. Congressman Jodey Arrington in studio. We've covered the Second Amendment. We've talked about that. I will say this, Congressman. I am very glad. I think if it was up to Speaker Pelosi, y'all would be in session right now, and you would be debating this. And she has not brought y'all back yet, which is good. And I think part of that is because Mitch McConnell said, "Yeah, we're not coming back early." And I think it's because emotions would be high, and we would get bad legislation coming out of Congress right now.
I think you're right. Now, there's plenty of work that Congress needs to be doing, so I'm always for us getting together to do our job. But in this case, you're right. I think there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions to this. And as you and I were talking about, the fundamental basis of the Second Amendment was the last check on tyranny and armed citizenry. It's to prevent the coercive, abusive power of a central government. And our founding fathers knew that all too well, didn't they?
Yeah.
And, of course, we've seen history littered with countries and peoples of those countries whose guns were confiscated. It didn't go well for them. So ultimately, that's the basis. But I'll also say, just with respect to the quote-unquote assault rifles, which may look scary, but they're semi-automatic rifles. And I would tell you that if people look at the assault, the ban on the assault rifle, the federal ban back in '94, I think it was a 10-year ban. The government did a study, and the government is generally not biased towards more guns. The conclusion was, and I quote, "no discernible impact on mass shootings, on deaths, on the scope and scale of injury, no discernible impact whatsoever." That's when they banned, quote, assault rifles for 10 years. So I just hope we can have a debate and discussion about the things that will actually go to helping prevent to the extent we can. But at the end of the day, I want to make sure that the good guys are armed and ready to meet with equal or greater force any perpetrator like the mass shooters in El Paso and Dayton.
Absolutely. You touched on this a little bit earlier. There have been numerous news stories about trade with China. You can probably count how many stories out there where it says that ag producers are upset that China is not buying agricultural goods anymore from the United States. What have you heard? What have you heard from the constituents here, the farmers here in your district?
Well, it's real in terms of the pain and the fallout from this tariff battle. For example, cotton producers have lost 50% of their market share in China. It's 1 billion people. It's a huge market. I think it's number 2 or 3, but we've lost 50% to our competitor, the Brazilian producers. But I think the president and his team, Bob Lighthizer, who is the lead negotiator, is doing all the right things and not settling for less than a real reset and real balanced and equitable and fair trade. Most politicians settle for something close to window dressing at best, and then claim a victory, but nothing happens. We have this huge trade imbalance, and China cheats. That's the bottom line. They cheat, and they have taken us for a ride, and they've taken advantage of politicians infinitum. I don't know, for decades. And they've met their match here. Now, this president's been smart by saying, we're going to take every stinking red cent, every nickel from the tariff revenue, and we're going to put it back in to those who've been most impacted, like our ag producers. So we went from $8 billion to now $14 billion in terms of this trade aid. And I think it's the right thing to do until we get to the other side, because there's two ways to lose in this reset with China. One is we don't give the president the runway to get a real deal. And I know he's committed to that. Secondly, we get to a real reset and real fair trade deal with them, and we look back and we have bodies strewn about in terms of producers, manufacturers, and others who couldn't go the distance. They couldn't persevere. So I think the president's doing the delicate balance of both, and I support him. And I promise you, the farmers who I'm going to be with tonight support him all the way.
Yeah. Let's also, I want to touch on this. Hopefully you can stick around for one more segment.
You bet. Yeah.
Okay, good. Just your overall thoughts so far on what you've heard from the 2020 Democrats running.
It's the gift that keeps on giving for those who want the House to be back in Republican hands. Open borders, socialism. Raise your hand, everybody, if you want to decriminalize border crossings. Every hand goes up. Raise your hand if you want to give folks, after they cross into our sovereign territory without any legitimate asylum claims, you want to give them, quote, free health care. Every hand goes up. I mean, the middle, when I say the middle, I mean the center right, center left, and independents. They determine ultimately presidential elections. They have the Democrats have lost the middle in this presidential debate.
Yeah. What do you think, and we may get into a little bit more of this after our next break, the retirements that we've seen in Congress, specifically in Texas. Do you think those will harm? And we will get to this after the break, because we only have about 40 seconds left. And what I want us to get into, how much of an impact will that have on the chances of taking back the House? And we'll also talk about how agriculture is going to be doing under the next session.
You got it.
Because we'll have some different leadership there. Chad Hasty Show, KFYO. Congressman Jodey Arrington in studio. We'll be right back. Chad Hasty Show, News Talk, KFYO. Our final segment with Congressman Jodey Arrington in studio is crisscrossing the district. He'll be in Morton at 1 p.m. at the Senior Citizen Center, correct?
That's right.
Yeah, doing another town hall.
Yeah, come one, come all. These are great ways for me to let you know what's really going on, cut through all the D.C. drama that you see on the news, cable news anyway, and an opportunity for me to listen to you and your concerns.
What are your feelings on the retirements that have been announced in Texas, and how do you think that impacts the chances of the Republicans retaking the House?
Well, I was sad to learn of Mike Conaway's retirement, especially because he has become a very close friend and really helped me and set me up and our district up for success by getting on Ways and Means, working on that cotton fix. I mean, I was front and center mainly because of Mike Conaway's help. And that's a big loss, but at the same time, Chad, 14 years, that's enough. I'm a term limit guy. I think 12 years is my term limit bill. It's plenty to make your impact and then go give it to another citizen legislator, just like they did, from the very outset. It will be tougher to win some of these seats. Like Pete Olson was in a seat that's targeted by the DCCC. I think he won by maybe a little more than 1%, but it is a competitive race. Kenny Marchant is another one. Mm-hmm. And those guys had name ID. They had the wherewithal in terms of resources and fundraising. So it's going to be a little tougher, no doubt. And we have 6 races in Texas, congressional races, held by Republicans, seats held by Republican, that are now DCCC targeted races that are about 1% to 2% in terms of the margin. And we lost 2 in Pete Sessions and John Culberson, Dallas and Houston. We're having a tougher time in the city. And now that's bleeding into the suburbs, which we always had the donut hole effect where we lost the city, we won the suburbs. Not the case. You got a tremendous amount of migration of different values from different places around the country to Texas. You have a millennial explosion. They're now the largest voting bloc at 70 million in this next presidential election. And then you've got the trend, the other demographic trend, which is the Hispanic community, which, by the way, the Hispanic community is completely aligned with traditional American values and with the Republican ideals of family and faith and pro-life, work ethic. To me, that's an issue where we need to quit being lazy, to me, as a party, and be more intentional and aggressive, just to sit down and engage and listen. I think that's really all that it's not a conversion in that respect. It's a conversation, and we need to do that more so that we can keep Texas the bastion of freedom that it is and has been, but it's the landscape shifting.
Yeah. When it comes to the national debt, and I know this is something that you've been talking about it. This is something that Republicans really aren't addressing right now. It becomes popular talking point when there's a Democrat president. It kind of dies off when there's a Republican president, except for the Democrats. Now the Democrats are all concerned about the national debt, but they weren't concerned about it when President Obama was in office. What has to be done? Is anything going to be done about the rising debt level in this nation?
We've got to sound the alarm. I think during the Tea Party movement, there was a reawakening of our consciousness with respect to our spending and our debt. We're almost $1 trillion in deficit spending at $22 trillion in debt. It is absolutely the long-term threat to this country. It is. Every generation has had their big challenges, the world wars, Great Depression, Civil War. The 21st century challenge for my generation, your generation, and those who are listening is to get our arms around this, get out of this hole, and be able to hand the country in good stead to our children and grandchildren. Otherwise, there's going to be a sovereign debt crisis. There's going to be a payday someday, and the chickens will come home to roost with our children and grandchildren, because this debt, and I've told my colleagues, quit calling it debt. That $22 trillion is a deferred tax on our children. It's easy to call it debt. We just keep borrowing from China. We just keep sleepwalking. No pain. Just expand government. No tax increase. No cutting of your favorite program. We are absolutely in a fantasy world, and we have a false sense of security. And it's no wonder that this is a backdrop to now socialism being talked about in the mainstream. Because if you feel like you can get something for free, then why not? If you feel like you can get health care for free without doubling your taxes, which is what it would cost. You know, all these things cost something, and they cost somebody, but it's not going to be paid by the folks basically who are there in Congress today. It'll be our children. I don't see lobbyists for children. I don't see various associations and advocacy groups up in the gallery of the United States House clapping and screaming and cheering on when we pass things that cost exorbitant amount of money. Where are the voices for our kids? That's what I'm trying to do, man. And I hope I can, if there's anything I can do after getting the farm bill, tax cuts, rebuilding the military. We did a lot of really good things my first term. But, man, I'm going to be I'm going to be a man on a mission here between now and the time the folks in West Texas call me back home, and it's going to be around this issue that you just talked about.
Before we let you go, what are some important pieces of legislation right now that are out there that, because of the politics of the day, and we are in election season, and we're heading towards that presidential election, most likely won't get through, most likely won't be touched, and there's going to be that House-Senate divide anyway. What's important that's not happening besides tackling the debt?
Well, USMCA is the new NAFTA. NAFTA supports 1 million jobs in Texas. We would add 170,000 new jobs, $70 billion in total economic impact to this country. Good for workers, good for manufacturers, great for Texas. And I can tell you all my Democratic colleagues that I talk to, especially in Texas, they're for it. It's a question of whether Nancy Pelosi is going to let it go, because it's about whether we give Donald Trump a win. It's not about whether it's good for America. That's sad. That's the reality of this political season. But it's also getting drug prices down for seniors. I've got a couple of bills that have passed bipartisan out of committee and the House that will help our seniors be empowered as consumers to choose the best value and best price of drugs, where there's really no way to discern that now. There's no visibility, no transparency. That was my focus. I don't know that that's going to go anywhere. So I've been named as co-chair, and this is a point of pride for all West Texans, but we've been named co-chair of a task force on rural health. We have a crisis in rural health care. We've lost 2 hospitals in this district. We have more rural community hospitals in District 19 than any other in the state of Texas, and we certainly lead the country because we have more rural counties in Texas than any other state. And we know how to fix this. We're going to fix this. And I got the chairman, Richie Neal, who's a Democrat from Massachusetts, to commit that this is a priority and that we're going to get this thing done. So I hope we can move on that one. I do think that one's truly bipartisan. I think the trade is being used as they're politicizing that. Yeah. And then they're spending all their time, I'm talking about them as the Democrat leadership and the left, talking about harassing, impeaching, and just obsessing over their hatred for this president. It's a losing strategy. At the end of the day, these radical ideas of open borders and free everything and banning cows and airplanes, along with the fact that they will be empty-handed in terms of meaningful bipartisan legislation that has done anything to advance this country and our cause and our people, is a recipe for Republicans taking back the House. Yeah. And so to that, I hate it for our country, Chad, because I want progress. I'd rather have our country win than political, wins. But at the end of the day, getting the House back and continuing to do the things that we did, like the tax cuts that got this economy booming, and getting the military in a position where they're safe and successful, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's what I long for. And we're 18 seats on net to flip to get the House back. And I think our chances are looking better the more those Democratic presidential candidates stay on stage and raise their hands.
Congressman, always good to visit with you. Appreciate you taking some time today. And by the way, I like the beard. That's a good look.
Listen, I told you your ratings went up when you grew that beard out. I thought, look, this is a little bit of an act of desperation on my part, but let's go. So
I like it.
Thanks.
Congressman, thank you very much. Chad Hasty Show, KFYO.